All right. Welcome, everyone, to Reframing Vaccine Diplomacy Amid Strategic Competition Lessons from COVID-19, hosted by the Wilson Center. My name is Alex Long. I am a program associate with the Science and Technology Innovation Program, and I welcome you all today. We have so many co-sponsors from the Wilson Center that I want to start off thanking. Primarily the Kennan Institute, who is primarily hosting this event, along with the Science and Technology Innovation Program, the Environmental Change and Security Program, the Africa Program, Latin American Program, and the Brazil Institute. This is such an important discussion, especially right now, as new variants of COVID-19 are spreading throughout the world, and also there seems to be a present apathy to dealing with some of the ongoing issues that we are dealing with every single day. More than 5.2 billion people worldwide have received a dose of COVID-19, according to the New York Times. But the discrepancies between low to middle income and high income countries in that statistic is still incredibly stark. So today we want to have a discussion about how vaccine diplomacy has played out over the past couple of years since vaccines have come onto the market, and what that means for the future of geopolitics and the power competition that we all are very well aware of. We have some truly amazing panelists that I cannot wait to introduce you to, and I will get right down to it. Our first panelist we have is Achal Prabla from the Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow. He's the coordinator of the Access IBSA project. We have Dr. Donna A. Patterson, a Wilson Center Fellow and professor at the Department of History, Political Science, and Philosophy at Delaware State University. We have Dr. Jessica Sclair, who is a research fellow from the Margaret Anstey Center for Global Studies at Newnham College in Cambridge. And we have Dr. Natalia Shuck, a George F. Kennan Fellow and Professor from the Przewalski Research Medical University. So welcome to you all. I hope that everyone is having a great start to the day or end to the day, depending on where you are. Let's get right to it. So first, what I want to do is have a more of an introductory question to show the audience how you are all coming to this space, because I think that we have a really great diversity of expertise here, and I want to make sure that the audience understands it first, so then when we have our discussion going forward, the audience is able to ask questions specifically to you all. And on that point of questions, please feel free to email kennan@wilsoncenter.org with questions, tweet at Kennan Institute, or write on the Kennan Institute's Facebook page. So without further ado, Achal, I'm going to start with you. What brings you into research related to the COVID-19 vaccines and global health?
Alex, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the Wilson Center. I live in Bangalore in India, and I've been working on the problem of pharmaceutical monopolies for about 20 years now. And up to this point, there was one point, I think, somewhere in 2015 when I worked on a vaccine against pneumonia. It's called the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, PCV, which had an access problem due to the monopolies that GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer had on these vaccines. But I hadn't really worked on vaccine access until the pandemic. And of course, by the time the pandemic rolled around, it became something that everyone in the world literally was invested in, including my parents, who live 5 minutes away from where I am in Bangalore, who love me very much. I love them very much, but I don't think they had really understood what I did until the pandemic came around, and they were personally invested in the solution that my work sought to get us. Unfortunately, I have to say, I have been spectacularly unsuccessful at pushing the needle on vaccine access for several reasons, and most of them unanticipated. I thought that we'd have far more success with the kind of exceptional circumstance that the pandemic presented in 2020 when it was declared. And instead, I found that the exception became an opportunity to deepen pharmaceutical monopolies rather than release the stranglehold that they had upon the industry and governments in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere, and the world. So where I sit now in Bangalore, for instance, I live in India, I work in South Africa and Brazil. I was just in South Africa and in Brazil on work over the last few months. And one of the stark differences between these three countries that I work in is that you can get an mRNA booster in South Africa and Brazil. These vaccines came very late to these countries, not at all as early as you might have got them in the United States or in Europe, but they did get there eventually. India, on the other hand, which has 1.3 billion people, represents a sixth of all humanity on this planet. We don't have a single mRNA vaccine available here. So my parents, who are in their late 80s and their late 70s, have been boosted with an AstraZeneca vaccine. The AstraZeneca vaccine provides exactly 0% protection against transmission of Omicron. It's pretty good when it comes to preventing hospitalization and death, which I'm thankful for. But unlike mRNA vaccines, which provide a lesser but still significantly higher degree of protection of about 25% against Omicron, the vaccines that we get here and are in use in many other parts of the world are vaccines, in fact, that the United States and Europe have used and then rejected in favor of better alternatives, mRNA technology. The mRNA vaccines, with mRNA stands for messenger RNA, are a remarkable technological development that only happened during the pandemic. The problem with them is that to date, and I'm talking about literally until last week, 93% of all mRNA vaccines that were contracted and supplied went to rich countries. So 50% of the world got 93% of mRNA vaccines. The other 50% of the world, the other half of the world where I live, got 7% of those vaccines, and none of them came to my country. Today, mRNA vaccines are slightly preferable. In 3 months' time, this is not speculation, this is fact, BioNTech, Pfizer, and Moderna, which are the makers of mRNA vaccines, will bring to market a bivalent vaccine that will work as well against Omicron and other variants as their original vaccine did against the original COVID strain. When that vaccine hits the market in the fall, there is no reason why anyone in the world should take any other kind of vaccine, except given the standards of mRNA vaccine distribution around the world, I fear that we'll return in some horrible Groundhog Day scenario to the situation in January 2021, when vaccines first hit the market. And so one of the things that I'm working on now, and that concerns me greatly, it also angers me personally, is that we haven't distributed mRNA vaccines, their manufacturing, the technology across the world in all of the places where they could be manufactured in a number of facilities on the African continent, in Asia, and in Latin America. And what we're doing is not only shortchanging ourselves today, we are potentially causing a catastrophe 3 or 4 months from now, and then maybe even in a couple of years when more and more vaccines and treatments for HIV or for other kinds of cancers get developed on this mRNA platform. And the monopolies on the mRNA platform technology mean that those products are still continuingly available only in very few parts of the world. So this is sort of my nightmare scenario, but I'm living in it as well. And so it's an interesting mix of anger and a desire to get something done on this that motivates me to continue to work in this pandemic.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and we will dig into so many of those things in the coming hour. Dr. Donna Patterson, why don't you go next? What brought you to this field and COVID vaccines in general?
Okay, thank you. In terms of arriving at this field, it was a bit of a trajectory moving from history of medicine, public health, and a medical anthropology, and really looking at pharmaceuticals and the pharmacy profession in French West Africa and post-colonial Senegal, but also some of the other medical professions there. And so in that work, for my book project, Pharmacy in Senegal, and some subsequent articles, I talk a lot about pharmaceutical markets, particularly in West Africa, looking at them both formal and, quote, legal pharmaceutical markets, but also informal markets, and what that looks like. And also in my work, I saw a lot of interest in Senegal for instance, wanting to really scale up manufacturing, pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturing in its country, in the country. And I know we're going to come back to that in greater detail. But in addition to Senegal, I've also looked at pharmaceutical markets in Ethiopia and Ghana, Morocco, and other places in a longer trajectory. So kind of coming off that, coming into COVID-19, my work there, my work in epidemics, I'm working on a book project now on Ebola, and all of that coming together. And thinking about vaccine equity and inequities, treatment equity and inequities. And so that's how I arrived here to look at COVID-19 vaccines and how they're distributed and how they're produced on the African continent and in other countries.
Great, thank you. And we will be getting into that deeper later on. Dr. Jessica Sclair, you are up next. What brought you to research related to COVID-19 vaccines and global health?
Well, yes, thank you so much, firstly, for the invitation to Alex and Natalia to speak on this webinar today. I should confess right at the beginning that I feel a bit of a fraud here. I don't really do research on vaccines or on global health. My work is really about elite philanthropy and particularly how it relates to international development and more broadly, global trends around the financialization of development. So it was really those things that have brought me to looking at vaccines, particularly around, well, specifically in terms of the COVID pandemic and the rollout, attempts to roll out COVID vaccines in the global south. So when COVID hit, I'm sure Donna, you'll probably have had this feeling too. There was a general feeling in academia, there has to be a COVID contribution. Yeah, we all need to write a COVID article. And I began to talk with a colleague of mine, Paul Gilbert at the University of Sussex, about what we were seeing in terms of the trends around us and how those connected to our own work. And of course, very quickly, we came to think about the rollout of COVID vaccines in the global south and started to look into this. And of course, very quickly found that philanthropy was playing an enormous role, a really key role, we think, in shaping the kind of global response to the pandemic and approaches to vaccine diplomacy and access to vaccines. So we wrote an article. Neither of us had really written about vaccines or global health before, but together we wrote an article trying to trace out and bring together some of the connections between patents. My colleague had done quite a lot of work around patents and assetization and the kind of growing financialization of the global economy and where the assetization of patents fits within that. And of course, the enormous role that big pharma have played, especially through TRIPS, in securing access, in making patents a kind of securitized product, an asset that can be traded on the financial markets. And of course, we now see, as you'll all know, that the securitized market in patents is now the bigger patent market. It's much bigger than the original market in patents themselves in terms of what they're designed to, in theory, protect. So we had that on one hand, and then we had this growing debate around access to vaccines and the patents that were preventing that in terms of their rollout in access to them and their rollout in the global south. And of course, the proposal for the TRIPS waiver that went to the WTO in October 2020. And then on the other hand, we had COVAX, which of course, as you all know, is the COVID-19 vaccines global access initiative, which has been really held up as the kind of one of the reasons why we, in theory, don't need a TRIPS waiver, because we have COVAX, and this is the global community's approach to rolling out vaccines more widely throughout the global south. And then if we look into COVAX, we see that COVAX hasn't come out of nowhere. It's come out of a much longer term approach to vaccines and international development, which has involved the WHO and UNICEF and lots of private and public partners. And really crucial to that, of course, has been the Gates Foundation and various other philanthropic entities. And so that through Gavi, which has been the much longer term vaccines initiative, and the associated international financing mechanism for immunization, which has pioneered the creation of vaccine bonds across the world, which is very much a financialized approach to front-loading money for vaccine rollout, and we can talk about that later. So when the pandemic hit and this question of how COVID vaccines were going to be accessed by most of the world's population who couldn't afford to pay vaccine prices with considering the patents on them, Gavi very quickly kind of assembled and developed COVAX, which was this new approach to vaccine rollout based on advanced market commitments to buying and donating vaccines to countries in the global south, and also to the creation of a huge number of new vaccine bonds specifically for COVID vaccines. So really what we've tried to do in this work we've been doing is to pull together these different strands, and therefore to show this really key role that private philanthropy, especially through the Gates Foundation, but others as well, has played in platforming this financialized approach to vaccine access, and how this has also worked very strongly, we believe, to delegitimize and to silence the kinds of calls for social justice that are really embedded in the proposal for the TRIPS waiver on COVID vaccines and therapeutics. So we've been trying to kind of connect those dots and show how these different processes are really deeply interlinked, and we think that philanthropy has been playing a really central role in doing that, which of course then leads us to this question of, well, what does philanthropy, in whose interest does philanthropy and international development really serve when we're seeing philanthropic initiatives really platforming these kinds of responses and silencing and delegitimizing what really are clearly much more social justice-based responses.
Thank you. And I don't think that it goes without saying that you are a fraud here, because with these global philanthropies, they have a seat at the table and affect the great power struggle that we are currently dealing with. So this part of the debate needs to be brought in, because ignoring it would be ignoring so much vaccine distribution and such a powerful arm that is almost always seen as a net positive and needless of critique, when really we do need to do more investigation on that. So without further ado, Dr. Natalia Schock, I would be remiss to not say that you are so integral to this event getting off the ground, and you are the person who pitched this event to me, and I think it's amazing. So I will now let you introduce yourself and talk about what brought you to this field, but I needed to at least give you that shout out at the beginning.
Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you, Wilson Center, that you supported this initiative. I'm very happy that we are all here now and trying to address this very important and I think forward-looking idea of how to approach vaccine diplomacy in the post-COVID-19 world. So I would like to sort of highlight what brought me to the field. And the main point that brought me here is that I strongly believe that the most impressive advances in research happen at the crossroads of disciplines and diverse opinions that we have today in our panel. And this passion helped me to approach my academic career. So I've graduated as a social worker, and then I gained the PhD in political science, and later joined the humanities department in medical university and obtained a doctorate degree in science and technological history. So since then, I have been involved for almost 10 years in medical humanities, science policy, and bioethics research, where I enjoy the advantages of my diverse knowledge and varied methods. So, and when COVID-19 challenged the world, I found myself, on one hand, personally frustrated, but at the same time, professionally excited, as Jessica mentioned. At once, all my research areas became tangible and trendy. And that crisis, I think, opened new opportunities for many scholars. And we still need to learn pandemic lessons for the future. And what was interesting for me, that despite the global nature of the problem, competition logic has framed international public health policies. And instead of building cooperation based on solidarity, politicians and media started vaccine races comparable to the history of space or nuclear arms races. And I've started to think big about global health challenges using my history of medicine and bioethics research findings. I've commenced tracing changes in international health and science policies using the lens of the Russian case and national security strategy of the state in vaccine diplomacy during the COVID-19 pandemic. Strategic thinking helped me to compose a bigger research question that I would like to highlight today for the discussion. Why did the great powers unite against polio and smallpox during the Cold War, but not act jointly on COVID-19, with the Cold War in the past and world much more globalized? The answer, of course, is much complex as the whole issue of COVID-19 diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy is. But today, addressing this question, I suggest to highlight the following thoughts. The first thought that I came up like last month during my Canon Fellowship here, it is highly unproductive to focus on the delusive conclusions that individual countries have failed vaccine diplomacy programs without broader and deeper regard to their foreign and domestic policy strategies, especially those countries who develop own vaccines. Also, we should not turn a blind eye to COVID-driven political evidence from different countries and regions and its implications for global health governance and future preparedness for future pandemics. And the second is thinking about the post-COVID global health policy and cooperation. We should not rely on the initial assumption that the health or vaccine development is a field of humanitarian international cooperation only. It is not there. United States, Russia, and China do not use vaccines occurred on the competitor's side. I mean, the same as a child mentioned at the beginning, Russia still doesn't have mRNA vaccine technology approved in the country. So people in this huge country do not have access to this advanced technology. But the good news is that we are in the right momentum for the social science and humanities scholars to examine the phenomena of COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy. That means, of course, to some extent, that we need to utilize the similar approach that Johns Hopkins University has done with epidemiological data. We need to collect public health and science COVID-19 policy data from different countries and regions, and interdisciplinary analysis of this data may help to produce data-driven and scientifically informed policy recommendation. So, and I hope today's panel will be kind of a seed or a platform for this future work, and I hope we will contribute a lot during today's conversation. Thank you, Alex.
Yes, and thank you. I think that's a great introduction, and we can get right started. So, Donna, I'm going to first throw it over to you. You mentioned in the beginning, in your initial remarks, about your past work, especially your book, Pharmacy in Senegal, Gender Healing and Entrepreneurship. And in that, you take the reader through an expansive understanding of pharmacies and the roles that they play, the many roles that they play. And I am wondering how you've seen the conversation around the African continent and their ability to produce and distribute vaccines, and where you think people might be getting it wrong, because I know that there's a proclivity to paint the whole African continent with a broad brush about their ability to manufacture and distribute. And I was wondering your current analysis on the African continent's ability to do these things and all of the countries within that you study.
Okay, absolutely. The capability in a number of countries already existed. You had some pharmaceutical production, you had some vaccine production, definitely not as much vaccine as pharmaceutical production, but you have it in a number of countries. Senegal has it. Senegal actually does produce some vaccine. South Africa has the capability. Morocco has the capability. Ghana has the capability. There's some pharmaceutical manufacturing in Ethiopia and some other countries. No, all countries don't have the same level of capability. And so I think when you're thinking about it, particularly thinking about COVID-19 vaccines, thinking about it in terms of regional production, if you will, maybe one or two countries per region, some of the ones that already have it in place and others that are trying to get there. In fact, today, Rwanda had a groundbreaking for a building that they're about to build to produce mRNA and other vaccines. So that's happening today. And so definitely that's there. And so I think when we think about these conversations, several African markets have been wanting to scale up for, I'd say, at least 2 to 3 decades. And you hear these conversations and talking to pharmacists and pharmaceutical manufacturers and others, because there is production, local production produced by African pharmaceutical groups or also in partnerships, but a lot of the production on the African continent too is Western or Chinese or other manufacturers that are just producing on the continent, but it doesn't belong to the continent itself, if you will. And so when you think about this, think also in terms of the context of the African pharmaceutical market. For instance, it's one of the fastest growing markets. When we came into the 21st century, it was one of the fastest growing markets. It grew from 4.7 billion in 2003 to 20.8 billion in 2013. And I don't know where the numbers are now, but I know the projections for a few years ago were about 45 billion. But I didn't have a chance to check them before this call. And so that's there. So when you're thinking about that, and also thinking about the attempts both at the country level, but also in terms of regional groups and continental groups and working towards pharmaceutical production, NAPAD, African Union, they've been calling for at least 20 years for scaling up pharmaceutical production. And so looking at that and some of the recent things that have happened, particularly I'd say the 2010s, a lot of regional meetings from UNECA, African Union and others, and also thinking about these regional free trade partnerships and what does pharmaceutical production look like in that. And so the conversations were there. But I think 2 things happened. One, COVID-19 accelerated conversations that had long existed about scaling up research and development and pharmaceutical production on the continent. And 2, when you think about this long historical trajectory, it was more profitable for the West and other countries to rely on Africa as a consumer market. So there was less interest in helping produce and helping fund or partner with people to be able to produce on the continent. And I think COVID really disrupted these conversations, and people were pushing in ways about equity and inequity and vaccine access. And we've seen that. If you look right now in terms of the dearth in COVID-19 vaccine access, it is the African continent. You know, it started off slow globally, but right now this is definitely the worst in terms of access to vaccines on the continent. There have been a lot of promises, partnerships, and that sort of thing about local production that still aren't happening or just barely happening. I'll stop there.
Well, I might make you go on for a little bit more on that. If they are not happening and the promises are there, what is the biggest challenge? Is it just a lack of motivation on behalf of the other side of the partnership, or how do you see moving forward the dial being, towards more vaccinations?
I think there are multiple things happening. Some could be lack of motivation. Some, I think, pledges were made, and maybe we've seen pledges in the past, and maybe they didn't materialize, and so maybe people thought they could back out of pledges. But I think now you really have this groundswell where people have to do it, or if you're not going to be the partner, someone else is going to be the partner. And so we'll move to that. And so I think it's given both local manufacturers, local governments, and some of these regional groups leverage in some ways to be able to do this. The other thing that we're seeing too is, you don't have the mRNA technology, for instance, on the continent. So it takes time. It takes time to put those things in place. And for instance, the Pasteur Institute in Senegal already has some capabilities, but now they're also building this new structure. So that takes time versus maybe outfitting some of the space you have now, even though it may be smaller production, but they're waiting to build these things. So that takes time. That takes investment. It just takes time to build and then get the supplies on the continent, a lot of which will be imported, just like so many of the vaccines and pharmaceuticals are imported. And I think that's really important to think about. I wrote something for African Arguments last year looking about Senegal and vaccine access. And in that, I talked about this quote from my book. There's a pharmacist, Dr. Ngom, who talked about, in her research to me, what if France embargoes us? What if there's an embargo on Senegal? We won't be able to get pharmaceuticals, because at that time, France supplied at least I'd say about 80% of the pharmaceuticals to the country. And when I go back and look at my own work, In 1970, 10 years after Senegal became independent, 98% of the pharmaceuticals coming to the country were imported. And even when you get into, the start of the 21st century, I'd say about 85% were still being imported. Now that's improved. It's improved to some degree in terms of some scaling up of local production, which is about 15% now. But another shift that we've seen in Senegal is who the suppliers are. Senegal is moving more from France and Germany and the US and Western countries and moving towards China and India and Dubai and producers in other parts of the world. And so that's been very interesting to see that diversification in terms of where we're getting them, what the costs are, and some leverage in that way.
I think Donna has got to a great core question of this panel, which is that shift and that like explicit vaccine diplomacy from countries that have and treating other countries as just consumers and not places of potential production. So Natalia, I want to shoot it to you and say, can you define for our audience what you see as vaccine diplomacy? And then also, I know that you've done past work and you published an op-ed, I think, in The Hill about the pre-Cold War and how vaccine diplomacy has changed since then. So I would love for you to, one, give a background on vaccine diplomacy to our audience, but then two, give us some examples of what it looked like before the Cold War and now what we're seeing based on your research.
Thank you, Alex. So the first thing that I want to highlight is the kind of definition of vaccine diplomacy is we still need to think about this. Since COVID-19 imposed the biggest challenge, I think, for the whole idea of the humanitarian nature of global health. I mean, in terms of competitive reality, surrounded the vaccine development, the medication, and masks diplomacy. So many diplomacies around the global health and COVID occurred recently. And so it's really strange it was really strange for me, it struck me that we didn't get the lessons from the past and we didn't use these lessons. And what I found interesting is that at one moment of time, the whole globe, had the same challenge. So we used to have, in comparison with the past pandemics, we used to have a kind of regional problems or countries' problems, which were located somewhere outside of other countries. But it was never the same way of dealing with a bigger issue at the whole parts of the world. And so that immediately imposed the idea that the first step that each country should do is to meet their own national security goals. That helped me to understand that vaccine diplomacy is not only the kind of vaccine empathy or kind of only the idea of to help those who are in need, but it's also about the political ends that each country has. And that is inevitable to us to see how COVID uncovered this nature of the global health and challenged the whole idea of what the global health was relied on in terms of the past experiences. And we also need to put together the past experiences and new experience occurred during the COVID when the whole globe was challenged and the whole globe was kind of concerned about how to fix the problem, not only in their own countries, but also to fix the problems outside the countries. And what Donna and Achal mentioned at the beginning, and Donna recently, that many countries understood, this is my opinion, of course, and I want to bring it for the discussion, many countries really understood that the idea that they need to have their own self-sufficiency and capacity to address and fix these global health problems, because at the beginning of pandemic, we all experienced lack of supplies. And we started to understand that vaccine diplomacy is not only kind of the shared values of global health, but it's also a part of competitive reality of lack of resources that we all had. And also, many countries realized that they sort of relied on pre-existed assumption that they can buy whatever they want in any moment of the time, but they were not prepared when all the countries needed the same product at the same moment of time. And they started to think broader about vaccine diplomacy. So we used to think about vaccine diplomacy as a kind of, we share supplies among countries. But now we started to think about vaccine diplomacy. What political ends we want to meet using vaccines first? And China was a great example of this. The second was what kind of diplomacy and political ends we can meet if the country have more vaccines and it can share it. What directions for these sharings this country can use? And also, in the case of Russia, of course, it's very interesting because the whole idea of pandemic was framed with sanctions. And if the country is sanctioned, what approach this country should use addressing the global health policy and national security needs facing pandemic? And of course, self-sufficiency became the really important point in this case. So I think we need to kind of think bigger and wider and collect the political evidence, as much evidence and data as possible to come up with the idea, how should we define the vaccine diplomacy and the global health strategy and governments for the future preparedness? So that's it.
Thank you. Achal, you were brought up, I think, in both the past remarks, so I'm going to throw it over to you. And I'd be interested to hear your perspective since you have worked in South Africa on these issues and you do work in India on these issues. But then also I know that you have spoken a lot about openness and opening up these processes. And I was wondering, especially with the talk about mRNA technologies and their lack of ubiquity, where you see open science and like an open sharing impacting the future of potential vaccine diplomacy or global health diplomacy to combat, the opposite, vaccine nationalism.
What I work on now is access to mRNA vaccines because the way that the pandemic has progressed, that's what all of us actually need to be thinking about. That all of us, that is, who are without access to mRNA vaccines. It really looks like the way that the virus is mutating and the way the science is changing and the pandemic is in this sort of weird zombie-like state, which is not quite dead, but assumed to be, but actually isn't. Means that we just have to spend a lot of time thinking about the ways in which we can fortify ourselves with the best technology available, which is mRNA technology. And that's a sort of another can of worms. But if we went backwards in time and looked at what happened over the last 2 years in the trajectory of the pandemic that's passed, there's some really interesting things I feel that we haven't fully considered. And I want to pick up from what Natalia talked about here because, and actually something that you mentioned. So you mentioned the phrase great power. And I think now, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it is a phrase that a lot more people have suddenly started speaking of. I follow a little bit of the dialogue around the invasion of Ukraine and especially the work of, I think he's an American political scientist called John Mearsheimer, who seemed to have popularized that phrase among a lay audience. It did, however, kindle in me, I think, some really profound understandings of what's happened over the last 2 years. So I grew up, just as context, in the Cold War, on the wrong side of the Cold War, that is not on your side, on the losing side. The first rock concert I ever went to was actually Alla Pugacheva, who was a Soviet singer, and it was actually Soviet propaganda. Not that I cared at the age of 17. But I say this as context to explain that I come from a slightly different perspective where it's not strange to deal with communist countries. It's not strange to have a communist party that actually wins elections sometimes in my country or in others that I work in. And what this meant was that I also had a slightly different approach to pandemic politics in 2020 and in 2021. And that led me very early to think about the impact of Chinese vaccines, which I wrote about, as well as Russian vaccines. And when you think about countries that behaved like great powers in the pandemic, really, the first country that comes to mind is China. China has produced multiple COVID vaccines. They don't have an indigenous Chinese mRNA vaccine, but they have actually a contract to produce BioNTech's vaccine in the country with a company called Fosun. But China, together, two vaccines, CoronaVac from a company called Sinovac, which is private, and a Sinopharm's Beijing COVID vaccine, together have vaccinated more people in the world than any other vaccine manufacturer has managed to do. Even actually alone, they've managed to do that. It's a remarkable achievement, which I don't think that any of us have really understood or particularly care about, in part because there's a kind of almost inherent geopolitical bias when writing about things like the Chinese vaccines, right from the start, right from the time they got out of the gate, really up to now, when at a time when they've been rendered far more irrelevant than they were earlier on in the pandemic. But there are other countries who behave like great powers, and some of them are surprising. One of them is Russia, for instance. So Russia actually developed the Sputnik vaccine at a government laboratory using as a government project. It was marketed abroad by the Foreign Direct Investment Fund, so by the sovereign wealth fund of the Russian state. And when it comes to openness, both the Chinese and the Russian vaccines were actually incredibly open. Now, I understand that all of this has to be layered with the kind of usual disclaimer about the politics of autocracies and so forth. And I absolutely, completely agree, and I'm angered by the same things that all of us are and should be. But when it comes to the vaccines themselves, the countries with the most closed governments and states actually created the most open vaccines. Anyone who wanted to make any of the Chinese vaccines could and did. So Brazil, for instance, where I work, its vaccination program got off the ground because Sinovac partnered with a state research institute called the Instituto Butantan, which is part of the state of São Paulo, not a federal institution, to run actually the vaccination program in Brazil for several of the first months of the pandemic when vaccines were available. The Russian Direct Investment Fund provided licenses to any manufacturer who wanted to make Sputnik. There was a problem with that. What happened later on was that it turned out that the Gamaleya Institute had not sufficiently worked out the production process for the Sputnik vaccine. And as a result, even though several people signed up for it, they couldn't actually produce it. And so that project eventually failed, but the ambition existed right at the start, right? Which is to say, we're a great power. This is what we do. In a pandemic, we create vaccines that can save the world. And Russia at least tried. China succeeded. But there's another country that behaved like a great power, and it's right next to the United States, and it's Cuba. Had the most interesting meetings, public meetings actually, very early on with the Cuban government, with their deputy health minister. By last year, Cuba had 2 protein subunit vaccines, which are sort of the top shelf of pre-pandemic vaccines. So, mRNA vaccines are our sort of top shelf vaccines today. But prior to mRNA technology existing, something called a protein subunit vaccine was the very best kind of vaccine technology you could produce. Cuba had not one, but 2 of those vaccines, and they offered them to anyone, anywhere in the world to produce on a very reasonable royalty basis, because it's, of course, from Cuba, which is a country with the least or the most insignificant skills in terms of marketing itself or anything it produces, and also because it's Cuba. Nobody actually noticed this or cared about it or wrote about it in any way, except for Vietnam and Iran, where there are actually Cuban vaccine manufacturing projects that are currently underway. And I have to say, there are 2 countries, and I have to say, India behaved like a very minor great power, which is to say that we produced a vaccine that ran into all kinds of trouble, but they did try to sell it off to a range of different countries, and I think exported it to a few. But the countries, guess who did not behave like a great power? The United States and Europe, who developed arguably the best technology in the pandemic, an mRNA vaccine, right? And this is a really interesting thing, because when you think about great powers, it appears as though the definition is limited to shipping arms and ammunition abroad, right? Something that's a more commercially feasible solution than breaking a monopoly or interfering with one. And I think the contrast, and this is a horrible thing to say, but I think that people like me who've been working every day in the pandemic over the last 2.5 years watched, just like you, with horror as the events in Ukraine unfolded. But I think also in a kind of strange fascination at the readiness of the White House, for instance, to mobilize funds to be able to support Ukrainians, to be able to send money and arms and ammunition to Ukraine, much of which is something that anybody rational should support. But I think it's also rational to question how it is that a pandemic in which 5 million people are estimated to have died in India in the course of the last 2 years did not evoke either that kind of political response or perhaps also that kind of popular response within the United States, right? Because the White House or the US government or Congress and the House in the US don't act alone. And obviously they were doing something which they believed there was popular support for. So how is it then that, it's possible to act like a great power when it comes to situations of war and intervening in situations of war? And it's possible to act like the opposite of a great power when you have as potent a technology and as a means to intervene as you do in situations of war, which you then exercise the option not to use during the greatest health crisis that the world has ever faced over the last 100 years. So I find that, historically, going back just over the last 2 years, the questions that most interest me are these: the fact that our idea of a great power, if we limited it to who did the most during the pandemic or who even tried to, provides a very different set of answers to the kind of usual understanding of who a great power is. And then finally, one very quick point to end this: I think because of this forced necessity, the fact that all of Latin America, for instance, did not have the kind of first user access to mRNA vaccines that Europe and North America had, meant that a lot of lines were redrawn. And the first line that was redrawn is that you can have a globally useful pharmaceutical product that comes out of somewhere not in the West. So think about everything that you use, right? Where was it developed? In the West. Everything I use, by the way, until last year or until 2 years ago, was developed in some facility in the West. It might be produced in India, but it wasn't developed in India. It was made in the West, except until the pandemic, when you had vaccines that could be used anywhere in the world that had utility, that did not come out of a laboratory in Germany or New Jersey. And so what it meant is that Indians suddenly discovered that we could produce vaccines. Cubans discovered they could make multiple vaccines. The Russians discovered they could make a vaccine. The Chinese discovered that they could make many, many more things, vaccines included. That did not actually happen. And it's not a way that people thought prior to the pandemic. But what also happened during the pandemic due to necessity was the way lines were redrawn. So you look at the countries that ordered Chinese vaccines, or you look at the countries that signed up to get a license to manufacture Sputnik. And it's not some kind of neat ideological map. It's not leftist allies or people who are aligned with communism. It was a regrouping of countries who looked around, figured out that they needed vaccines, couldn't get them from the West, found that there was absolutely no help available from the West, and then just worked out the best way to get them. And I find that political map, the production of vaccines in places which we didn't expect vaccines to be produced, developed and produced, and then the consumption of those vaccines, they create a really interesting redrawn political map of the world.
Okay, we will be getting into many of those things in the last half hour, but I wanted to talk about another source of great power, which is the elite philanthropies. And Jessica, if you could speak to how these philanthropies have kind of assumed a role as a nation in a lot of the ways of distribution, but then the financialization of the process and what that means for global health governance moving forward as you see it.
Sure, thanks, Alex. I wonder if I could just briefly comment on what Ashal was talking about before I go into that big whole black box. But I think this is really, really interesting, Achal, and thank you for that overview. And it's so interesting hearing the individual countries as well. and where they sit. Actually, most of my work is actually in Brazil, although not not on COVID, because I wasn't able to get out there. But and you're right. Brazil is a really fascinating example in relation to this. Brazil has, like many other places, as Donna was telling us, also a really amazing history of production of generics. And there's this whole movement during the 90s for antiretroviral treatments for AIDS, HIV, and the real push from actually not a left-wing government, a kind of centrist government towards, as Ashal will know, the production of generics. So yeah, there's a whole history to this, as you've both pointed out, which I think is so absolutely crucial for us to understand, and really important also to realize how that context and history across Africa, across so many other parts of the world, has just been totally absent from media discussion about this, I would say. I mean, certainly from where I'm sitting in the UK, we never see anything about this. Yeah, all we hear is that countries in the global south can't do it. They don't have the facilities, and et cetera, et cetera. So important to throw a spotlight onto this, I think. But also what Ashal was saying was, so I think this question of who acted like a real power, to me, it's really interesting because I see all of this through the lens of kind of financial capital and the relationship between the state and the private sector and the financial markets. And to me, this really speaks to the particular relationships and power structures between financial markets and capital and the state in these different countries, and the level of the capture of the state by private and financial interests. When you look at countries across Europe and, of course, the States, what we really see is this complete capture of state interest by finance. Yeah. And if we look at our trade architecture and the way that has been developed, which, of course, I'm really talking about patents here, obviously, but this, if we look at the history of this, it's so telling. So, TRIPS was, if you look at the history of TRIPS was basically created by 12 lobbyists sitting around a table who just came up with this kind of legal, these global trade laws for the entire world, based on their own interests. And big pharma were absolutely central to that. They were overrepresented at that table. So Pfizer was at that table, for example. That has become our global trade architecture, and that has become the kind of the legal framework through which states work across Europe and in America, in North America. It's also a question of who's in charge of the state, who's really driving things. And I think that it's really telling then to see how these different countries then responded to COVID. And I mean, Brazil is fascinating because, of course, this will happen under Bolsonaro's rule, who's from the extreme far right, but still actually not quite. I don't think the state in Brazil has quite been infiltrated in the same way, perhaps, by these kinds of financial interests, even though they're still incredibly strong in Brazil. But anyway, sorry, just to add that. But in terms of the philanthropists and the financialization of development and financialization of global health and their contribution here, I mean, really, I wanted to speak to Ashal's points because the kind of the very wealthy global elite philanthropists that I'm talking about are really, in my opinion, are representative of these broad financial interests, and they see so Gates and kind of equivalent foundations are really pushing an ideology which understands poverty, global inequalities, international development through a very particular ideological framework, which is grounded in the idea that capitalism can provide solutions to all of our international development challenges, even though we there is no evidence for this, and we've seen repeatedly that this is not going to work. And actually, the role of elite philanthropy in global health and in other areas of international development is not a new phenomenon. We've seen this since the end of the Second World War, even further back. The Rockefellers, for example, the Carnegie Foundation, all really instrumental in driving the kind of international development project post-war, coming out of the States and then spreading throughout the rest of the world, and very much and increasingly based on these ideas of market-based solutions, which have kind of come to their natural conclusion now in terms of seeing philanthropy as a for-profit activity. So we're now seeing the rise of impact investing and these ideas that the most appropriate approach to international development is a for-profit model based on ideas around blended finance and the state leveraging money and front-loading in order for the private sector to be able to front load money into development solutions. So all of this stuff around the vaccine bonds and the approach and COVAX and the response to COVID are very much emblematic of that approach that has been going on, I think, around international development for quite some time and changing in subtle ways, but very much dominating the kind of contribution of philanthropy to international development. And I had another point that I've forgotten, but I think, maybe I'll leave it. Just to say that there is a kind of long history to this. So COVID has both enabled the deepening of these approaches, these kind of for-profit approaches to philanthropy, and also is symptomatic and an expression of what's come before. And this, for me, is very much about a kind of a particular elite, financial elite kind of view of the world and how development challenges are going to be overcome. So really what we see is symptomatic of a much broader process at play.
Yeah, and when we're talking about these competitions and diplomacy, following the money is so important, and especially when that money is all centralized in one part of the world, especially. Natalia, I'll throw it over to you.
Thank you, Alex. I actually have a question to Jessica. So I just want to put together what Achal has said and Jessica and address the question to Jessica. So as far as I know, I'm not an expert on philanthropies, but philanthropies, as you mentioned, is an independent vaccine player or global health player or kind of, the vaccine power. We can use this term for this particular discussion. But philanthropies do not operate in a similar way globally. I mean, so there are some countries that do not have, this activity from philanthropies like, China, Russia, maybe others. And so when you see the philanthropy's role on the global health arena and also comparing their roles with these territories, big, huge territories which operate themselves like independently, how do you approach, this kind of new level of maybe competition or maybe new level of global health policies development, using the idea that philanthropies, they are huge and very influential, but still they have limited access to very big areas in the world.
Shall I answer that now, Alex? Or?
Yeah, go ahead and answer it now. And then
sure. Okay. Thanks, Natalia. Yeah, no, I think this is really, really important, and that the value of a global conversation, a truly global conversation like this, shows us that we, things are very different from different standpoints. And absolutely, I think there's kind of two answers to that question, because on one hand, yes, the kind of philanthropy we see in Europe and especially in North America is not paralleled in other parts of the world. Yeah, I mean. Well, India, there's a very interesting book that's recently come out about the history of philanthropy in India in shaping ideas about national development. So India is a very interesting example, but we don't necessarily see the same level of influence in terms of philanthropy in different places. Having said that, we need to remember that the Gates Foundation is the second biggest donor to the World Health Organization. Yeah, you all know this, but it's really important, I think, to state it. Yeah, the States is the first biggest donor, but Gates give more money than the UK or Germany or any other country in the world, and they have enormous influence over agendas through the WHO, which and they so for example. People talk about the Gates approach to global health, which has been this real drive to move away from the strengthening of health systems and towards this very top-down, disease-specific kind of interventions, of which the vaccines are a kind of emblematic example, which can find their solutions in the market, and you drop in particular solutions to different processes. And this has seen a real shift away from a kind of the sort of Doha commitment to the strengthening of health systems across the global south. So yeah, on one hand, I think certainly in terms of vaccine diplomacy and what we're talking about today, COVAX is clearly irrelevant in China, and pretty relevant, and definitely relevant in Cuba, which is great. So on one hand, we need to look from different standpoints and see that there's a kind of reach to the philanthropic influence, which I am kind of collapsing here, the philanthropic influence and the broader financial markets influence, because I think they're very combined. On one hand, there's a limit to that reach, but on the other hand, through multilateral organizations such as the WHO, which of course are present in different ways in different places, certainly Gates has been incredibly influential. I think that's a way of having that philanthropy's had a much broader reach.
Achal, I'll throw it over to you.
Thank you, Alex. So this is just a quick intervention. I not a question so much as a reaction to what Jessica was speaking of, and of course what Natalia was also speaking of, which is when you asked earlier about openness and the curious fact that the most purportedly open democracies such as the United States and Europe, who have this incredible technology, refuse to do anything to try to share it with anyone else, whereas in fact the vaccine technology developed by the least open societies such as China, Russia, and Cuba were available and still are to be shared by across the world with anyone who wants them, right? And a funny thing is that when how it connects to the financialization of pharmaceutical industries and pharmaceuticals, health and life, and a state takeover is this, right? Which is curious. So we think of Sputnik V as the Russian vaccine because it was funded by the state and it was produced by state laboratories. We think of the Cuban vaccines as Cuban government vaccines because again, everything is the state in Cuba. We think of the Sinopharm vaccine as the Chinese state vaccine because Sinopharm is a public sector entity, it's owned by the state, right? We don't think of Moderna as the American government vaccine. Guess who provided over $1 billion, which covered 100% of Moderna's R&D? You, the US taxpayer through the American government, right? And several hundreds of millions of dollars on top of that, again, just for research. This is not counting the several $1 billion that went into pre-orders and buying the actual vaccine back, the vaccine you paid for. We never call it the American government vaccine, right? We don't call BioNTech the German government vaccine, despite the fact that federal funds in Germany, up to the tune of about $500 million, went into BioNTech to aid the development of the BioNTech mRNA vaccine, right? Now, not only is this just a question of nomenclature, a nomenclature that we can't use. I mean, it's inconceivable for us to say this is the American government vaccine, right? But that nomenclature and our thinking around this and the way that we use these terms is connected to the laws that surround how this funding moves from you, the taxpayer, through the US government to a private pharmaceutical corporation, and what responsibility is entailed when that money changes hands, right? In the United States' case, which is the legislation I know best because I've worked there, that responsibility is zero. What it means in turn is that let us just assume that one person in the White House, right? Actually, at some point in these last 2 years, when I had multiple conversations, by the way, with people who worked in the White House and on the COVID task force, actually understood what I was saying and said, yes, he's right, they're right. We should do something to get Moderna to do this. The truth is that there are limited things you can do, like a government use to take over patents, et cetera, but to actually get Moderna to share its technology with a company in India, to contract a company in India to produce its vaccine, there is no law in the United States that the White House can feasibly use to get Moderna to do what it wants to do, to share vaccine technology that it funded and created itself through taxpayer funds. And this really is why we're in the problem we're in. And I wanted to put that out there because I think it's a really significant fact that sometimes, we just gloss over as being a completely natural part of daily life, right? Without questioning very much. Sorry, thank you.
No apologies at all. That was great context. And Donna, I think that this question of openness of technology and then also access hits on both your research, but then also a couple of questions that I've got from the audience that I'm going to kind of merge into one. And one of the questions is, what can be done to address this global health disparity to convince donors that the COVID situation in Africa should not be ignored? But also understanding that, and this has been brought up a couple of times, where different countries around the world have had to kind of do it on their own and become these new great powers in emerging markets. So I'm wondering what you see as coming out of COVID-19, while we are definitely still within the pandemic in Africa and the countries within it are so under vaccinated, how you see the gains that have been made by the amount of, you know, not pressure, but importance that have been placed on these emerging markets within the African countries that you study, and where you see like the future and the positives moving forward, but then also like the biggest gaps to getting there. And I'm not saying that it is just sharing technologies, but I am saying that I'm sure that that is a part of the discussion and what Achal just brought up.
Okay, that's a lot. I hope I have it all. I think, well, some of this I think I addressed earlier in terms of the gaps, in terms of some of the infrastructure, but also funding. But it is good to start seeing those shifts. There will need to be more. So what can be done? I think the biggest thing is, sharing resources, be it technology, be it funding for infrastructure, training, perhaps, but also rethinking about how people view African pharmaceutical markets, moving from consumers to producers and partners, equal partners in this. And I think that's very important. The Africa CDC was very happy about this momentum and was predicting, I forget the number, I think it's by the middle of this century, something like 60% production, pharmaceutical production on the African continent, which would be major. And this is something I've been talking about a long time, about the need for more production on the continent. And so in the conversations that I've had, just thinking about some of the meetings I've been at, but also some of the conferences. I mean, we talked about this, for instance, at a panel almost a decade ago at Harvard Business School. And there were a group of us, someone from India, someone who works in the US, and there were a couple of other people. And so we were talking about this and what this looks like, both in Africa, but other places, in terms of equitable production and scaling up these partnerships and capabilities. But also, I kind of brushed over some of this, I think, at the beginning, talking about some of the meetings leading into this, and those conversations that were happening, particularly in places like Addis Ababa, a number of meetings, these sorts of things, and how, they were pushing these conversations, both in terms of private and public partnerships, but other ways. And again, COVID-19 just really accelerated those conversations. For instance, I was in Addis in January, February 2019. I was there for 2.5 weeks at AU meetings. Bill Gates was there, going back to the Gates Foundation that keeps coming up. In fact, I was thinking as you two were talking that the last two meetings that I went to on the continent, because I still haven't traveled internationally since COVID-19 for, at least in my case, obvious reasons. But the last two meetings I went to, one in Ethiopia and one in Nairobi in November 2019, Melinda Gates was at the 2019 meeting. So thinking about that influence. So when you're having these meetings, both on the continent, but also the World Health Organization and otherwise looking at development or health, or even politics, they're often represented, and also, members from their organization. So I think that's really important that you all brought that up. I'm trying to read my handwriting on all the questions here. So I think really in terms of closing these gaps, again, just really thinking about it in terms of partnerships and really people being able to scale up R&D and production, because I think, and Natalia talked about this earlier, we have had these lessons. We've seen this. We've seen SARS, we've seen Ebola. We see what happens. The world is interconnected. Global health security is interconnected. What is happening in China, what is happening in Guinea, what is happening in DRC can very well impact you anywhere in the world. Now we're seeing monkeypox and what that looks like, and now how that's shifting into something else here. But also even in monkeypox, in terms of treatment and vaccine access, where it was something that existed on the African continent for decades. But now in terms of how it's being treated and how the media attention looks very different now that it has come to the West. And we saw that with Ebola. We saw that in some ways with even COVID-19 when it starts in China. I think people took it more seriously, but not as seriously as they should have in spring 2020. And we saw what happened in Western Europe, and we saw what happened in the US, before, we see what happens around the world. So I think it's very important to think of this not only in terms of profits and consumer markets, but global health security. And if the conversations are really framed and really centered around that true equity, things will look very different in terms of what's shared, where pharmaceuticals, where vaccines are produced, because if the world truly wanted to keep each other safe from a public health context, that's what it would look like.
Yeah, and those are the dangers of the financialization that Jessica was talking about, and how if we just keep framing things as like material solutions, whether it be nets for mosquitoes or shots for people, we're going to work ourselves into the same corners that we've been boxed into since, honestly, forever. So I want to move this discussion in our final 18 minutes to talking about what we see as going forward as important to remember from this moment to, this conversation will not end here, especially our work, Natalia, at the Wilson Center, and Donna. So excited for this as a seed for a lot more. But Natalia, you emailed me earlier with a quote from Emmanuel Macron, "A war of influence over vaccines." And, positioning vaccines as this national security apparatus and this tool, I think, is a scary way to talk about it moving forward, because it does connect the diplomacy, vaccine and global health diplomacy, with national security so tightly. And I do understand why those ties and bonds exist. Achal, you mentioned earlier about our ability to send a lot of money to help with the war in Ukraine. But also and then drawing the parallel when America and the US did not send vaccines to where they were most needed at the current time, but then also how the public responded when they saw vaccines leaving the country, that they felt more people need to be vaccinated in the US than they did anywhere. So that vaccine nationalism that then kind of crops up within the public, leaders then have to weigh the global good versus their political gains. So Natalia, I know I've said a lot, but I do want to pitch it over to you to talk about this future of vaccine diplomacy and how this moment has changed potentially what might happen in the future.
Thank you, Alex. I will try to be very short to give the space for other speakers to contribute to this question. But I think the most important part that I mentioned at the beginning, that we first need to collect the data. So to map the policies that occurred, that we also found that we are living in so competitive and diverse world, and countries showed up very different approaches trying to meet their political ends using vaccines. So we need to collect all this evidence and put together and see what had happened, and then try to figure out how to redefine the way how global health operates, and how bigger countries, the countries who developed vaccines and countries who contributed to vaccine diplomacy, failed in terms of their own policy that they offered, like Israel, like Hungary, like Serbia, like African countries, India itself. I think the India example is most fascinating because it has their own capacity. It has several alliances that India is involved, and these alliances sometimes have very different kind of political goals, like Quad or BRICS, or their own national strategy. So we need all this data to be collected. And I think that the most important thing that raised during this conversation, that technology that biotechnology became very dividing component of vaccine diplomacy during the COVID. So the competition around technologies had kind of undermined the state-private relationships, the interstate relationships, and global health policy itself. So it looks like we have to think about the more comprehensive strategy towards technological cooperation. So now we have the world that is divided, and everybody are talking about their technological sovereignty, about new approaches to developing self-sufficiency in terms of technologies and science. And it looks like we need to think very precisely about what political ends do we meet when we are talking about the technological sovereignty, and in terms of especially global health and in their connections to global health security. So COVID-19 highlighted that we have a very big gaps in between national biosecurity and global health security. And so how to address these questions? First, we need to identify the core reasons for this competition and these gaps. And I think we are on the right way in doing this, having this broad conversation and asking the very strong and very powerful and very complex questions like we have today.
Achal, I want to give you some space to, one, respond to that, but then also just to talk about how you view the current state, because I know that you published extensively on the, it's more than just donations. We can't just send over 120 million and then slap it up on the cover of the New York Times and then we're good. So I want to hear what you think the next steps really have to be to make this a more equitable future based on, we're almost trying to rebuild the plane that we're flying in, right? So, because we're still within COVID-19 and these issues are still so pertinent. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. So look, I think a good way to start would be with donations, right? And Alex, you were speaking of the idea of the political unfeasibility of sending vaccines that could be needed for Americans abroad, right? And that has its own whole sort of complex history. But the simple way, I think, to address that particular question, which I have great sympathy with, is that the way that the United States and Europe have failed the world is not necessarily by, getting 10-year-olds vaccinated before 80-year-old healthcare workers in other countries who haven't got vaccines, but by not having a feasible plan for the world in any sense, right? And what I mean by that is the technology that was developed with federal monies in Europe and in the United States could have been shared, could have been contracted to other companies in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, so that vaccines could have been developed simultaneously in the quantities that were necessary in the places that they were needed in, right? And so that it's just a fine distinction, but it's worth pointing out that there were politically feasible solutions, right? Which, would not have created the same kind of moral outrage of, why are you, prioritizing Senegal before, Boston or whatever it is. So I think so that's a fine point, right? Because I want to precisely identify the ways in which the United States and Europe have actually failed us, the world, and I think ultimately themselves, as I'll explain, in this pandemic. Because I do think that a part of what drives this idea of donations, which, have a place. Look, my parents, they're in their 80s and 70s, as I explained, and I would very much like them to get the next generation mRNA vaccine, which will be, the first of any of the next generation COVID vaccines that will exist, that you will have access to in 3 months, right? And my parents don't care whether they get it as a donation from the US government or whether they get it through some kind of contract that I'm trying to, to fight for, to get them produced in India. How do they care, right? I mean, they would like to have the best booster available in the shortest possible time since it comes to market. But the truth is that idea of donations, the idea that the only way to do this, right, public health, and by this I mean public health, is to donate, to be able to have compassion, to have empathy and share and so on. That very much comes from the philanthrocapitalist vision of the world, right? And it's really hard to tell what motivates that, whether it's just, whether it's actually something clever and strategic or just stupidity. And I mean this sincerely, I'm not being snarky here or whatever, but the truth is that it is really difficult to understand what motivates that kind of thinking, because it's incredibly wrong. So a colleague and I worked on a survey, a very detailed and deep survey of who in the world can make mRNA vaccines. And it turns out that there are literally about 5 times as many pharmaceutical companies who can make mRNA vaccines as can make the previous vaccine technologies, because they're actually more complex, right? So mRNA is like an MP3 file as compared to previous vaccines, which are like manufacturing a long playing record, which is so much more labor intensive. So there are over 100 companies across Asia, Latin America, and Africa who can produce mRNA vaccines, but are not. And they're not because BioNTech, Pfizer, and Moderna won't contract them on commercial terms to make these vaccines. And the German government, the EU, the UK, and the US, most importantly, won't do anything to facilitate that process. So the interesting thing about this in terms of sort of where it ends up, I think, is in a repudiation of both, and I hesitate to use this phrase, a sort of Western supremacy, or a kind of prevailing, Western dominance in the pharmaceutical industry, right? Which is all that I've ever lived with, all that any of us here have ever lived with, right? And I say that as a fact, not as a slur, meaning that every medicine that we've taken has been produced in the West. Every single thing that any of us has taken, right? And I think that looks like it might change. And the second thing that looks like it might change is this idea that all of these countries outside of the West are a little helpless and need the caring guidance of donations from governments or advice from Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation and so on in order to survive. And I'll explain what I mean by this. So right now, for instance, necessity, again, the lack of available mRNA vaccines, the best technology that we have in this pandemic, has spurred over a dozen new mRNA development projects, many of which are in their last stages of development. And so even if a fraction of them succeed, right? So let's say 2 or 3 of them succeed, that is going to double the number of mRNA vaccine technologies we have in the world, which will create significant competition for BioNTech and Moderna, the 2 current dominant players in that market. What it will, and where are those vaccines coming from, by the way? So some of them are being developed in Western countries, but they're also being developed in China, in Thailand, in Vietnam, and in India. So in a way, the lack of foresight of the European Union, the UK government, the United States government, this White House really, has already created a broader pharmaceutical industry which has sort of awakened its true self in some way and understands that it too can innovate and develop and create new products, right? That it doesn't have to depend either on the technologies developed elsewhere or their benevolence in terms of accessing donations or even, frankly, licenses to contract and manufacture things. So in a very strange way, for the very first time, this didn't happen with AIDS. It didn't happen with hepatitis C. It didn't happen with other diseases I've worked on, like chronic myeloid leukemia. Didn't happen with cystic fibrosis, right? But it did happen with COVID. And it's unlikely to stop with COVID because that genie now has escaped the bottle, right? And why should it go back? And I do think that it wouldn't have happened had very early on in the pandemic, the United States and Europe and Germany had, a somewhat greater evil strategic vision and just said, look, we want the Western pharmaceutical industry to dominate the world forever, right? How could they have done that? By getting these companies, BioNTech and Moderna, to license the 100 companies we identified to produce their vaccines. Every other mRNA vaccine project would have been killed. Who would have invested in projects when you had a very viable vaccine at your doorstep, right? But we don't have those viable vaccines at our doorstep. And so the industry actually is fundamentally changing. And I think in the long term, this is going to be better for the world, worse for the United States and Europe. And the only problem with it is that it comes at a great cost, right? The cost that it comes at is the kind of turmoil and anguish that I personally feel, for instance, with regards to my family, right? With like every single person who lives in India, literally 50% of the world, which doesn't have access to these vaccines while we wait for them to be developed and for a new order to form. That is the cost of it. And it's a tragic cost, and I don't think that people are going to forget that it was due to the negligence and actually the inaction of the United States and Europe that it happened.
With our last 5 minutes, I want to make sure Jessica and Donna have a chance to comment on everything that was just said or give your last thoughts on that. So, Jessica, I'll throw it to you first, but then Donna, if you have any last things.
Oh yeah, difficult to do it in 2 minutes because there's so much to say there. But I just wanted to speak to a child's question about what makes philanthropic capitalism focus on donation. Well, I mean, I feel like there's quite a kind of obvious answer to that, actually. I think that this is totally ideological. You know, these guys don't come, Gates hasn't just emerged from nowhere, yeah? He led the kind of development of patent, the patent approach to predatory capitalism, Microsoft, yeah? He is the king of patents. This is very ingrained ideas about capitalism as a kind of global social and economic system, and a deep, intense belief that capitalism, predatory capitalism, has all of the answers to all of our global problems. And actually, I think we have to appreciate how strongly held that view is, even though we know it's completely wrong. Yeah, so this is where these philanthro-capitalist approaches are coming from, and this is where this resistance to more justice-based redistributive solutions, such as a complete, not just a TRIPS waiver, a complete like disposal of TRIPS, comes from. I think I don't think it's more than the ideology, actually. And but it's positive to hear what you're saying, Ashal, about how the global kind of the pharmaceutical industry in other countries is starting to kind of be spurred on by this. And actually, it's interesting that the big pharma didn't just license all these little companies. I think possibly they underestimated their capacity, actually, to produce and to be able to do what they're doing. And I think the future really lies in completely redesigning the global trade architecture. I think the TRIPS waiver needs to go through. This is an opportunity. Of course, it's stalled for 2 years, and you would think that global pandemic, if anything, would get this conversation started. And I think we need to, well, certainly, I mean, we all have different contributions, but I think one important contribution is to really focus on blowing up that, like increasing that conversation. Yeah. So all of this needs to be more awareness around everything that Achal, Natalia, Donna have been bringing to this conversation about capacities in the global south, about the kind of data that we need to collect. This needs to be in the global conversation, because at the moment it's being hidden and silenced by these very strong financial powers. But I think it's positive that countries are starting to just go ahead and do this, and that needs to be that needs to be kind of boosted. I think that is the way forward.
And Donna?
Absolutely, I agree with that, and I'm glad Ashal brought that up in terms of kind of India and the world. I talked about it in terms of Africa, but I think that's very important. I think these conversations and these developments are going to really disrupt what pharmaceutical manufacturing looks like. So in the next 10, 20 years, it'll be interesting to look back on this and see what actually happens. But I think even in that, when you think about vaccine trials and the research and development for the mRNA vaccines and some of these other COVID-19 vaccines, who participated in the trials? It was mostly people from the global south. And I'm really thinking about the case of South Africa, for instance. So South Africa participated in a number of trials, including Pfizer. But when the Pfizer vaccines were rolled out, South Africa couldn't gain access to those vaccines, and all the fights with Pfizer and then some with Moderna. But Pfizer, I really thought about Pfizer because it's very interesting whose bodies are used for the trials, but then where are they in line to get access to the finished product? In the end, South Africa wound up getting a lot of Pfizer vaccine, but it took a long time and a lot of fights to get there. And so I think that's just what I'll end with, just thinking about what real health equity looks like.
Well, thank you all so much. We are 1 minute away. Natalia, do you have anything you'd like to say? All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Please, this video of this discussion will be on the event page after this event is closed, and from the Wilson Center, from the Kennedy Institute, from the Science and Technology Innovation Program, from all of our other sponsors of this event. Thank you so much. Thank you to Achal, Jessica, Donna, and of course, Natalia, for getting us all in this room together. I really appreciate it. And far more content to come, I am sure. So have a great morning, everyone.